Hello and welcome to Generation 16, the series that showcases the history of Sega's Mega Drive. I'm your host, Greg Seward.
Techno Cop. Busted.
Are video games getting too gory? That's the question posed on the cover of the March 1991 issue of Video Games and Computer Entertainment magazine. The article itself cites games like Narc and Splatterhouse as examples of the ever-present violence found in video games that is made much worse by the increased fidelity and, as a result, increased gore factor made possible by more powerful game consoles like the TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis. Front and center in the article is Razorsoft president Kyle Shelley and his company's first game, Techno Cop.
The advantage of the Genesis system is the realism that's brought to the party. With 16-bit products, we can be as graphic as we like, and you can see the results with Techno Cop. Kyle Shelley.
It's not like Shelley was oblivious to the controversial nature of the graphic images in his first game. In fact, Techno Cop's box features a warning on the back that states, "Not suggested for children under 12 years of age." As far as I can tell, this is one of, maybe even the first time a console game came complete with a warning label on the box. Sure, it was hidden on the back of the box, but it was still there. You are the Techno Cop, final member of an elite crime-fighting unit called the Enforcers, the last line of defense against the gang of criminals known as the DOA. You're armed to the teeth with exploding rounds and a supercar equipped with side-mounted cannons and nuclear torpedoes. Techno Cop's gameplay is split evenly into two different mechanics. You start each mission in your VMAX twin-turbo interceptor with orders to get to the location of your current target. Along the route are all manner of enemy vehicles trying to get in your way or ram you off the road. And as you have a limited amount of time to reach your destination, destroying these rolling roadblocks is of the utmost importance. Once you've reached your goal, you forge ahead on foot to find your target and take them in or take them out. In order to take a criminal alive, you'll have to switch to your snare gun. Otherwise, you'll mow down society's undesirables with your trusty 95 Automag pistol with ammo designed for internal explosions. That's why everyone you shoot is reduced to a red, meaty pool of body parts. I feel like the driving segments in Techno Cop should be a lot better than they are. For some odd reason, you have to push up on the D-pad to accelerate. I've always found this makes for very difficult steering, and due to the enemy's tendency to try and block you, good control is pretty damn important. The other problem is that your weapons are supremely inaccurate, constantly missing gigantic targets. Then, at other times, when you're firing wildly, you'll see explosions before you even see the target you've apparently destroyed. Otherwise, though, the drive from crime scene to crime scene is generally boring, only intensified by the fact that you have a time limit you have to beat, and the whole thing feels like it moves at a snail's pace. The on-foot levels are filled with criminals, hookers, rats, and other hazards. Control here is really sluggish, especially when shooting. I'm not sure, but I think that the animation when the Techno Cop draws his gun takes a bit longer than it should, and thus makes the shooting feel really unresponsive. Throw in a situation where a criminal is standing right in front of you, which the game does often, and panicked presses of the attack button lead to absolutely no result. It's infuriating. And because the Techno Cop doesn't really react to damage in any major way and doesn't get any sort of invincible grace period after a hit, it's easier for him to take loads of damage in a matter of seconds and lose a life. Unless you're paying attention to his life bar, it's really easy to just die unexpectedly. This is all made worse by the scrolling, or rather, the main character's position while the screen scrolls. For some reason, the game keeps the Techno Cop very close to the leading edge of the screen, meaning you have about 0 time to react when an enemy appears. You get so jumpy that you start stutter-stepping the screen forward and firing, which, by the way, will lead to killing the innocent civilians who like to hang out in these areas for some reason. This slow and methodical style doesn't really work anyway, because you're under a strict time limit here as well, and the levels aren't linear. Take too long to find your prey and they'll escape. Letting your target get away doesn't result in the game over, but it also means you won't get the next scheduled upgrade for your crime-fighting car. That upgrade mechanic is actually my favorite part of the game. If you successfully complete your mission, you might start the next drive with, say, spikes sticking out of your wheel wells or side-mounted cannons. The release of Techno Cop welcomes a new country to the Mega Drive family. The original computer game was developed in Canada by Grey Matter Incorporated and Image Excel for a bevy of computers like the ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, Amiga, and Commodore 64. It was originally published by Gremlin and US Gold. Grey Matter was founded by Chris Gray in Oakville, Ontario in the mid-80s, hot off the heels of his success with one of Canada's first major game releases, Boulder Dash, and his Infiltrators series. Techno Cop was one of the very first games released by the newly minted studio in 1988, and really, it's not all that different from Infiltrator. Both games feature alternating in-vehicle and on-foot segments. It's just that, this time around, our protagonist pilots a weaponized car rather than a helicopter. The Canadian game industry in the early 90s was dominated by a couple of companies. Grey Matter was one of them, as it was about to go on to produce more than a dozen games over the next 8 years before finally closing in the mid-90s in spite of so much success.
Unless you have a monster hit, you're pretty much hand-to-mouth in terms of project to project. You might have one great year, but 2 years later, you run out of money. Chris Gray.
Gray laid some of the blame for Grey Matter's closure at the feet of the Ontario government, which had been slow to offer significant tax credits for the games industry, something that British Columbia was way ahead of the curve on, which is one of the reasons why the other major Canadian game developer, Don Matrix Distinctive Software, was able to thrive, eventually being purchased and becoming Electronic Arts Canada. Gray was right. Provincial tax credits are a major reason why large game publishers come to Canada to this day. The co-developer of Techno Cop, Image Excel, was a sister company to Grey Matter. Founded in Oakville by Kevin Hoare, it only released 2 games before being bought by GameTech in 1995 and then acquired by Take-Two Software in 1997 when it became Rockstar Games Canada. Today, in 2018, it's known as Rockstar Games Toronto. Kevin Hoare is still the studio manager. 2 different console ports of Techno Cop were planned. One was for the Nintendo Entertainment System and involved Grey Matter itself. According to Nick Gray, who did the graphics on the original game, the NES version got far enough to be submitted to Nintendo. He fondly remembers the feedback the game got from the Japanese giant.
In Techno Cop, the buildings you visited were intentionally modeled on seedy locations. We were aiming for a vaguely dirty, hairy motif. There were pixel art females who were intended to read as prostitutes. The only note we got from Nintendo was, make the women's breasts smaller. They look like prostitutes. Nick Gray.
The Genesis port was done by Punk Development, which was Razorsoft's development partner early on. According to a Game Developer Research Institute interview with Kevin Seghetti, Punk Development founder Jeff Spangenberg did the actual port to the Genesis himself. You may recognize Jeff's name. He would go on to found Iguana Entertainment in 1991, which was a prolific developer in its own right before being acquired by Acclaim. Jeff would then found Retro Studios in 1998, but would leave before the completion of Metroid Prime. Finally, Jeff founded Top Heavy Studios, creators of the Guy game, which seemed like nothing but an excuse to get college co-eds to take off their tops on camera. Although Technocop was just as violent on its original systems, it doesn't seem to have stirred up nearly the controversy back in 1988 that the Genesis port did in 1990. Though a few magazine reviews did call out the violence, there doesn't seem to have been any major backlash. And while original artist Nick Gray admits that the game was over the top, he says there was no desire to be controversial at all.
We did sort of turn up the exploding enemies dial to 11. That was just us having fun. I don't think we considered it gory. It was pixel art, and movies like Dawn of the Dead had long since set a really high bar for what you'd call gory. We just did what we thought was cool. Nick Gray.
But when the game hit the Genesis, oh boy. The article I spoke about at the beginning of this video was just a small part of the backlash. The game apparently sold around 50,000 copies in December of 1990, which was successful enough to put it directly in the crosshairs of a New Jersey-based group calling itself Parents Against Video Violence. Formed the same month Techno Cop was released on the Genesis, the group took shape after a PTA meeting in which concerned parents started voicing their fears about the violence their children were being exposed to through video games. Spokesperson Lawrence Heath took aim at Shelley, Razorsoft, and Technocop, and the two would spar through the media over the following year. Heath demanded a rating system. Shelley agreed that self-regulation was something the games industry should do. Heath insisted that regulation should have government oversight, and you can guess how far the conversation went after that.
It's a much more realistic depiction of violence. Usually in these things, someone shoots and the body just disappears. In Technocop, the guy screams and there's blood all over the screen. Thing is, most parents have no idea what's in there. Lawrence Heath.
These people seem to think that violence of any means is bad. I loved Arnold Schwarzenegger in Total Recall, and Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry, but I have no desire to go out and shoot someone. Kyle Shelley.
Remember that the United States in 1990 was a hotbed of parents and concerned citizen groups trying to come to grips with the media their children were consuming. The Parents Music Resource Center under Tipper Gore and the Washington Wives had spent the past 5 years getting parental advisory warnings on music, only to have hardcore rap and hip-hop rise to prominence in the late 80s and 1990 and push the bar further than it had ever been pushed before. The NWA was Straight Outta Compton, the Ghetto Boys in Texas, and, of course, the American Family Association and Jack Thompson in Florida trying to classify Two Live Crew's album As Nasty As They Wanna Be as obscenity. A few music retailers actually got arrested for selling that album. And yes, that's the same Jack Thompson who would later crusade against Rockstar Games over the content of titles like Grand Theft Auto, Manhunt, and Bully. The point is that by 1990, the tolerance for the sex and violence in media that was regularly consumed by minors seemed to be at an all-time low. Something big was about to happen, and video games were quickly becoming the main target of all this ire. A lot of people point to the famous 1993 Senate committee hearings on video game violence as the birth of the ESRB rating system that the industry still uses to this day. And while games like Night Trap, Mortal Kombat, and Lethal Enforcers have always been held up as the main catalysts, I would argue that Technocop might have been the tipping point. But why the 3-year gap between the release of Technocop and the government fixing its gaze on the games industry? Well, the nation had bigger worries at the end of 1990. In an article published in the Oklahoman on Valentine's Day 1991, author John Denton leads with the assertion that the violent video games issue had taken a back seat to the nation's focus on the war in the Persian Gulf. In that same article, Razorsoft's president himself insisted that he was all for a rating system and spoke some very prophetic words.
If we don't do something now, something else will be forced on us later. Kyle Shelley.
But let's not give Kyle Shelley and Razorsoft too much credit as champions of the cause. They were well aware of the marketing power of a warning label on a box. Razorsoft's Michael Brazier admitted as much in an interview during the summer CES in 1991, where he said his company was proud of producing games full of gore and violence, and that they happily put warning labels on the games because, quote, as soon as we did, sales went through the roof. And that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please like, share, and subscribe. And remember, you can support Generation 16 through Patreon. Join me next episode when we take a look at the first fully 3D game to come out of Japan for the Mega Drive. See you then.